The rain had been falling since late afternoon, the kind that didn't just wet the streets but soaked into bones and moods alike. It drummed steadily against the cracked sidewalks of the city's south side, turning potholes into shallow mirrors that reflected broken streetlights and tired lives. Marcus Johnson pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself as he stepped off the bus, his breath visible in the cold evening air. In one hand, he held a worn backpack stuffed with paperwork and a lunch container. In the other, he gripped the small, warm fingers of his 6-year-old daughter, Aaliyah. "Daddy, it's really cold," Aaliyah said softly, her big brown eyes blinking against the rain. "I know, baby," Marcus replied, forcing a smile as he bent slightly to her level. "Just a little more walking, okay? We'll be home soon." Home was a small, one-bedroom apartment above a closed-down grocery store. The heater worked when it wanted to. The ceiling leaked in the corner, and the walls were thin enough to hear arguments from neighboring apartments. But to Marcus, it was still home, because Aaliyah was there. Since her mother had passed away 3 years earlier after a sudden illness, Marcus had learned how to be everything at once: father, mother, provider, protector. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, but he never allowed that weight to show in front of his daughter. That morning had started like most others. Before sunrise, Marcus had woken up at 5 a.m., quietly slipping out of bed so he wouldn't disturb Aaliyah. He prepared her breakfast, laid out her school clothes, and packed her bag before getting himself ready for work. His job as a janitorial supervisor at a mid-sized corporate building downtown wasn't glamorous. The pay barely covered rent, groceries, and daycare. But it was steady, and steady was something Marcus valued deeply. At work, he was invisible to most people. Executives walked past him without a nod. Employees barely noticed him unless something was dirty or broken. His boss, Richard Collins, noticed him, but not kindly. Richard was the type of man who believed authority meant volume and respect meant fear. He often spoke down on Marcus, criticized him publicly, and reminded him, subtly and not so subtly, of his place. "Johnson, you missed a spot on the 3rd floor yesterday." Richard had barked that very morning, standing with his arms crossed. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied calmly, even though he knew the complaint wasn't true. He had learned long ago that arguing never helped. Keeping his head down was how he kept his job. By the time Marcus picked Aaliyah up from after-school care, the rain had already begun. They waited nearly 20 minutes of the bus, huddled under a narrow shelter that did little to block the wind. Aaliyah hummed softly to herself, and Marcus watched her with a mix of love and worry. He wondered if he was doing enough, if she felt the absence of her mother as deeply as he did, if one day she would resent the life he was trying so hard to hold together. As they walked the final stretch toward their apartment, Marcus noticed someone ahead of them, an elderly man struggling with a cane. The man wore a long, dark coat that looked far too thin for the weather. His steps were slow and unsteady, and every few seconds he paused, bending slightly as if catching his breath. The rain plastered his gray hair to his forehead. Marcus slowed his pace instinctively. "Daddy, that man looks sad," Aaliyah whispered. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, he does." They were already running late. Marcus still needed to heat dinner, help with homework, and get Aaliyah to bed on time. His feet ached, his back was sore, and all he wanted was to sit down. Still, something tugged at him as he watched the old man nearly slip on the wet pavement. "Wait here a second, baby," Marcus said gently, guiding Aaliyah under the small awning of a closed shop. He jogged forward, rain splashing against his shoes. "Sir," Marcus called out, keeping his voice respectful, "are you okay?" The elderly man turned slowly. Up close, Marcus could see deep lines etched into his face, eyes clouded with exhaustion rather than age. "I'm fine," the man said, though his trembling hands told a different story. "Just need to get to the bus stop." "That stop's another 2 blocks, Marcus said. "It's pretty slippery out here. Mind if I walk with you?" The man hesitated, pride flickering across his face. "I don't want to be any trouble." "You're not," Marcus replied firmly but kindly. "My daughter and I were heading the same way." The man glanced back at Aaliyah, who gave a shy wave. Something softened in his expression. "All right," he said quietly. "Thank you." Marcus took the man's free arm, steadying him as they walked. With every step, he could feel how frail the man was, how each movement required effort. The rain intensified, soaking Marcus's jacket completely, but he adjusted his body to shield the man as best he could. "My name's Harold," the man said after a moment. "Harold Whitman." "Marcus," he replied, "and that's my daughter, Aaliyah." "You're a good father," Harold said suddenly, watching the way Marcus kept glancing back to make sure Aaliyah was safe. Marcus smiled faintly. "I try." They reached the bus stop just as headlights appeared in the distance. Marcus helped Harold onto the bench and offered him his lunch container. "There's some food left," he said. "You look like you could use it." Harold shook his head. "I couldn't." "Please," Marcus insisted. "I can make something else at home." After a long pause, Harold accepted, his hands shaking slightly as he held the container. "Thank you," he said, voice thick. "You didn't have to do all this." Marcus shrugged. "Someone once helped me when I needed it. Just passing it on." The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes. Marcus helped Harold on board, making sure he was seated before stepping back into the rain. As the doors closed, Harold pressed his hand against the window, nodding deeply at Marcus. Aaliyah ran up and hugged Marcus's leg. "Daddy, you did a good thing." Marcus looked down at her, rain dripping from his hair, exhaustion weighing on him, but his heart felt strangely light. "I hope so, baby." They walked the rest of the way home in silence, the rain easing slightly as if acknowledging the moment. Marcus didn't know who Harold really was. He didn't know that this simple act of kindness would ripple into his life in ways he couldn't imagine. To him, it was just the right thing to do, something his own father had taught him long ago. That night, as Marcus tucked Aaliyah into bed, she asked, "Do you think that old man will be okay?" Marcus kissed her forehead. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think he will." What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the next morning, when he walked into work soaked not by rain but by routine, the man he had helped would be standing at the center of a storm far greater than any weather. And that storm would change how his boss and his entire world looked at him forever. Morning came quickly, as it always did from Marcus Johnson. The alarm buzzed at 5 a.m., slicing through the quiet darkness of the apartment. Marcus reached over and turned it off before it could wake Aaliyah. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the faint water stain on the ceiling above his bed, listening to the soft rhythm of his daughter's breathing from the other side of the room. His body ached from the day before, and the dampness from the rain still seemed to cling to his bones, but there was no time to linger. Life didn't pause for exhaustion. He slipped out of bed and began his routine. Coffee brewed weakly in the small machine on the counter while he packed Aaliyah's lunch. Peanut butter sandwiches cut neatly into triangles, apple slices sprinkled with a little lemon juice so they wouldn't brown. He moved quietly, efficiently, like someone who had learned to function on autopilot. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the elderly man from the night before. Harold, the way his hands trembled, the gratitude in his eyes. Marcus wondered if he had made it home safely, if the warmth of the bus and the food had helped him even a little. "Daddy," Aaliyah's sleepy voice floated from the bed. "I'm here, baby," Marcus said, walking over. "Time to get up." She rubbed her eyes and smiled. Did it stop raining? Marcus peeked out the window. The sky was gray but calm, the streets washed clean as if the night had rinsed away something old. "Yeah," he said. "Looks like it did." After dropping Aaliyah off at school, Marcus headed downtown for work. The bus ride was crowded, filled with people staring into phones or out windows, lost in their own worries. Marcus stood holding the pole, his reflection faint in the glass. He looked tired, more tired than he felt. Still, there was a quiet sense of peace in him, something he hadn't noticed before. Helping Harold hadn't solved his problems, but had reminded him that kindness still mattered, even when life felt unfair. The corporate building loomed ahead, all glass and steel, towering over the street like a monument to ambition. Marcus swiped his badge at the service entrance and stepped inside. The familiar scent of cleaning chemicals and polished floors greeted him. He changed into his uniform, tied his boots, and started his rounds. Something felt different. Usually, the mornings were loud with complaints. Emails printed out, and handed to him with sharp instructions. Employees stepping around him as if he were part of furniture. Today, there was a strange quiet. People glanced at him, then looked away quickly. A few even nodded. Marcus frowned slightly, but said nothing. He was restocking supplies on the third floor when his co-worker Tanya hurried over, her eyes wide. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "have you heard?" "Heard what?" Marcus asked. "There's some big meeting happening upstairs. Executives everywhere." Richard been pacing like he's about to explode. Marcus shrugged. "That's every day." "No," Tanya insisted. "This is different. He's nervous." Marcus returned his cart, dismissing the thought. Richard Collins nervous? That was new. Richard thrived on control. He enjoyed reminding everyone that he answered directly to the building's ownership group, that he had power. Nervous didn't fit him. A little later, Marcus was called into Richard's office. The moment Marcus stepped inside, he felt the tension. Richard sat stiffly behind his desk, tie loosened, his usual confidence replaced with irritation and something else. Unease. "Johnson," Richard said, clearing his throat, "I need you to accompany me upstairs. Now." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, though confusion stirred inside him. They walked in silence to the executive floor, an area Marcus rarely visited. The carpet was thicker, the lighting warmer, the air heavier with expensive cologne and authority. Outside the main conference room, several well-dressed men and women stood talking in low voices. When Richard saw them, he straightened his posture immediately. "Stay here," Richard whispered sharply to Marcus. "And don't say a word unless spoken to." Marcus nodded, standing against the wall like he'd been trained to do. The conference room doors opened, and the murmurs stopped. A tall man stepped out, leaning slightly on a cane. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. It was Harold. But this Harold was not the frail man from Rain. His gray hair was neatly combed, his dark suit tailored perfectly. His posture, though still careful, carried authority. The lines on his face remained, but his eyes were sharp, clear, commanding. Conversation ceased entirely as he walked past, executives nodding respectfully. Harold's gaze swept the hallway, and then stopped. He looked directly at Marcus. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. Recognition flickered, followed by something warmer. Harold's lips curved into a small smile. "Good morning, Marcus," he said calmly. Richard spun around so fast he nearly tripped. "Why, you know him?" he stammered. Harold turned his attention to Richard, his expression neutral. "Yes," he said, "I do." Richard's face drained of color. Harold took a step closer to Marcus. "I was hoping I'd see you again," he said. "I didn't get a chance to thank you properly last night." Marcus swallowed, his heart pounding. "I'm glad you're okay, sir." Harold nodded. "Thanks to you, I was—" The executives exchanged glances. The air thickened with unspoken questions. Richard cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Whitman," he said, forcing a laugh. "We were just about to begin the meeting." "We will," Harold replied coolly. "But first, I'd like a word with Marcus. Alone." The color fully left Richard's face. Yes, of course," he said, stepping back. Marcus followed Harold down the hallway, his mind racing. He had no idea who this man truly was, only that something significant was unfolding, and he was standing at its center. They stopped near a large window overlooking the city. Harold turned to face Marcus. "You didn't recognize me, did you?" Harold asked gently. Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. I just saw someone who needed help." Harold smiled, a genuine, appreciative smile. "Exactly." He paused, then continued. "I own this building, Marcus, and several others like it." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. "And I've spent years watching how people treat those they think don't matter," Harold added quietly. "Last night, soaked and tired, you treated me with more dignity than many people have in boardrooms." Marcus didn't know what to say. His thoughts went to Aaliyah, to the rent due next week, to the countless times he had swallowed disrespect to survive. Harold placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Kindness reveals character," he said. "And today, character matters. Behind them, through the glass walls, Richard Collins watched, his confident world beginning to crack. And Marcus realized in that moment that the rain from the night before had not simply washed the streets clean. It had uncovered something hidden, something that would change his life and his bosses forever. The conference room doors closed softly behind Harold Whitman and Marcus, sealing off the hushed chaos of the hallway. Inside, the room was vast and elegant. Long polished table, leather chairs, a wall of windows overlooking the city skyline. The executives seated around the table straightened instinctively as Harold took his place at the head. Marcus stood near the wall, unsure where he belonged, his heart still pounding from the shock of the revelation. Harold rested both hands on the table, his cane leaning against a chair. He scanned the room slowly, deliberately, his eyes settling on each face in turn. No one spoke. The silence carried weight. "Before we begin," Harold said calmly, "I want to address something far more important than quarterly profits." Richard Collins shifted in his seat, forcing a tight smile. "Of course, Mr. Whitman. Whatever you'd like." Harold turned his gaze toward Richard, his expression unreadable. "Richard, how long has Marcus Johnson worked in this building?" Richard blinked. Several years, sir. A dependable employee." Marcus felt a familiar sting at the word dependable. It was what people said when they didn't bother to learn anything else about you. "And how would you describe your treatment of him?" Harold asked. The room seemed to inhale. Richard's smile faltered. I treat all my staff fairly." Harold nodded slowly, then leaned back slightly. "Interesting," he said, "because last night, in the pouring rain, this man, after a full day of work, took time to help a stranger who had nothing to offer him. No title, no influence, no power." Harold's voice hardened just a fraction. "That stranger was me." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Though many executives already knew Harold was the owner, few had imagined him walking the streets alone in such conditions. "I wasn't testing anyone," Harold continued. "I was simply tired and cold, and I wanted to see the city as it truly is." He turned to Marcus. "Tell them what happened." Marcus hesitated, then spoke softly. "I saw a man who looked like he needed help. That's all." Harold smiled faintly. "Exactly." He faced the room again. "Marcus didn't ask who I was. He didn't assume I was beneath him. He treated me like a human being." Harold's eyes returned to Richard. "Can you say the same?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Mr. Whitman, if I've ever..." Harold raised a hand, silencing him. "I've reviewed footage, complaints, reports, patterns." Richard stiffened. "For years," Harold said evenly, "you've managed through fear instead of respect. You've humiliated staff publicly. You've ignored recommendations for raises. And you've shown particular disregard toward those you believe cannot fight back." The words landed like blows. Marcus stared at the floor, a strange mix of validation and discomfort settling in his chest. He had never wanted revenge, only fairness. "I built this company on the belief that leadership starts with dignity," Harold said. "When that dignity is missing, everything else is hollow." Richard stood abruptly. "This is unfair," he snapped. "You can't judge my entire career based on one employee's story." Harold's gaze never wavered. "I'm not." He pressed a button on the table. A screen behind him flickered to life, displaying documented complaints, dates, and footage. Evidence. Richard's shoulders sagged. "I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave," Harold said calmly. "Effective now." The room was silent again, heavier than before. Security stepped forward. Richard's face flushed with anger and disbelief. He glanced at Marcus, really looked at him. For the first time, "This is your doing?" Richard hissed. Marcus met his eyes steadily. "No," he said quietly. "This is yours." Richard was escorted out, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Harold exhaled slowly and turned back to the table. "Now," he said, "let's talk about rebuilding." The meeting continued, but Marcus barely heard it. His mind raced. When it finally ended, Harold approached him again. "Walk with me," Harold said. They moved back toward the window. The city below buzzed with life. Cars, people, motion. Harold leaned on his cane. I want you to know, Harold said, that I didn't do this because you helped me. I did it because your kindness showed me the truth. Marcus nodded, unsure what to say. I also reviewed your file. Harold continued. You've taken on extra shifts, declined time off, never complained. Marcus thought of Aaliyah's school events he'd missed, the nights he'd come home exhausted. I believe people like you deserve more than survival, Harold said. They deserve opportunity. He paused. I'd like you to move into facilities management. Better pay, flexible hours. Marcus's breath caught. Sir, I don't know if I do, Harold said simply. Tears burned Marcus's eyes, but he blinked them back. Thank you, he whispered. Harold smiled. Thank you for reminding me who I am. As Marcus left the executive floor, whispers followed him. Not judgment, but respect. For the first time since he'd walked into the building years ago, he stood a little taller. The power had shifted. And it wasn't because of anger or revenge, but because kindness finally had been seen. Section 4. A new morning, a changed man, and the legacy of kindness. The elevator doors slid shut behind Marcus with a soft chime, carrying him down from the executive floor. As the numbers descended, he leaned lightly against the wall, exhaling a breath he felt like he had been holding for years. His reflection in the mirrored panel looked the same. Same uniform, same tired eyes, but something inside him had changed. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a narrow hallway with no doors, but like a room full of light and possibility. When Marcus stepped out onto the main floor, the building felt different. Conversations paused as people noticed him, not in the way they used to, no sidelong glances or indifference, but with curiosity and something that looked a lot like respect. Tanya caught his eye from across the lobby and hurried over. Marcus, she whispered, her voice shaking with excitement. What just happened? Richard was escorted out by security. Marcus smiled gently. Things change, he said simply. She studied his face, then broke into a wide grin. About time. Marcus finished his shift in a daze. He followed his routines, checked schedules, spoke with staff, but now people listened. They asked questions. They thanked him. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable, yet deeply affirming. By the time he clocked out, his legs were tired, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Outside, the air was crisp but clear. No rain. Marcus looked up at the sky and thought of Harold, of the fragile man he'd walked beside in the storm, now revealed as someone powerful yet profoundly human. It amazed him how quickly life could turn, how a single moment could ripple outward. That evening, Marcus picked up Aaliyah from school. She ran into his arms like she always did. But today, Marcus lifted her just a little higher. Daddy, you look happy, she said, wrapping her arms around his neck. I am, baby, he said, kissing her cheek. I really am. At home, over a simple dinner, Marcus told her the story, not about power or punishment, but about kindness. Remember the man we helped in the rain? He asked. Aaliyah nodded eagerly. Yes. He turned out to be someone very important at my job, Marcus said. And because we helped him, he helped make things fair. Aaliyah thought for a moment. So being kind makes good things happen? Marcus smiled. Sometimes. But even when it doesn't, it still matters. Later that night, as Aaliyah slept, Marcus sat at the small kitchen table reviewing paperwork Harold had sent him. Training opportunities, benefits, a schedule that would allow him to attend school events and doctor visits without fear. For the first time, he imagined a life where he wasn't constantly choosing between work and fatherhood. Weeks passed, and the changes settled in. The building's culture shifted. New leadership emphasized respect. Complaints dropped. Smiles became more common. Marcus worked hard in his new role, not out of fear, but pride. One afternoon, Harold invited Marcus to lunch. They sat in a quiet cafe, sunlight streaming through the windows. You know, Harold said, stirring his tea, that night in the rain reminded me of who I used to be before success made life comfortable. Marcus chuckled softly. I'm glad I could help. Harold shook his head. You did more than help. You restored something. As they parted ways, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace. He returned home to Aaliyah, to laughter, to warmth. The rainstorm that once seemed like just another hardship had become a turning point, a reminder that dignity, kindness, and humanity still held power. And in a world that often overlooked men like Marcus Johnson, one simple act ensured he would never be invisible again. Before sunrise, he still woke with the same instinctive tension in his chest, the habit of worry carved by years of struggle. But now, mixed into that familiar feeling was something new. Hope. It was fragile, cautious, yet undeniable. The first real change came the Monday after Richard Collins was escorted out of the building. Marcus arrived early as always, but instead of heading straight to the janitorial supply room, he was asked to report to an office on the fourth floor. His name was printed neatly on a temporary sign taped to the door. Marcus Johnson, Facilities Management. He stood there for a moment, staring at it, almost afraid to open the door in case it disappeared. Inside, the office was modest but clean. A desk by the window, a chair that didn't wobble, a small filing cabinet. Marcus ran his fingers lightly across the desk surface, grounding himself. This was real. Throughout the day, employees stopped by, not to complain, but to introduce themselves. Some thanked him quietly. Others apologized for never speaking to him before. Marcus accepted it all with humility. He didn't feel superior. If anything, he felt more responsible. He remembered too well what it was like to be ignored, disrespected, unseen. He promised himself that no one under his watch would feel that way again. That evening, Marcus picked up Aaliyah from school earlier than usual. When she saw him waiting outside instead of rushing in late, her face lit up. "Daddy, you're early," she said, grabbing his hand. "I am," Marcus replied with a smile that reached his eyes. "And guess what? I'll be early more often now." On the walk home, Aaliyah chatted endlessly about her day, about a drawing she'd made, about a classmate who made her laugh. Marcus listened closely, something he hadn't always been able to do when his mind was buried under stress. The city around them felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. At home, Marcus cooked dinner, while Aaliyah did her homework at the table. The heater hummed steadily, a small but welcome victory after years of inconsistency. As they ate, Aaliyah looked up at him seriously. "Daddy," she said, "are you still going to help people when it rains?" Marcus paused and smiled softly. "Always, baby. Especially then." Weeks turned into months. Marcus grew into his role naturally. He learned budgets, maintenance planning, and staff coordination. Harold Whitman checked in occasionally, not as a distant owner, but as a mentor. He listened when Marcus spoke, truly listened, and that alone taught Marcus what real leadership looked like. One afternoon, Harold invited Marcus to walk with him outside the building. The air was cool, the sky overcast, but no rain. "You know," Harold said thoughtfully, leaning on his cane, "I've spent decades building companies. I thought success was measured in numbers, properties, influence." Marcus nodded, hands in his pockets. "But that night," Harold continued, "I realized something. None of that matters if we forget how to treat people." Marcus looked at him. "Most people don't see janitors or security or cleaners as people," he said quietly. "We're just there." Harold stopped walking and met Marcus's eyes. "I see you," he said firmly. "And because of you, others will too." That promise proved true. Changes spread beyond the building. New policies were implemented. Training focused on dignity and accountability. Promotions were earned fairly. Slowly, a culture rooted in fear was replaced with one built on respect. For Marcus, the greatest reward wasn't the pay raise or the title. It was time. Time to attend Aaliyah's school performances. Time to help with science projects. Time to simply sit beside her at night and listen to her dreams. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the window, Aaliyah leaned against Marcus on the couch. "Daddy," she said sleepily, "do you think Mommy will be proud of you?" Marcus's throat tightened. He kissed the top of her head. "I think she always was," he whispered. Outside, the rain continued to fall, soft, steady, cleansing. Marcus thought back to that night, when he almost walked past an elderly man because he was tired, cold, and overwhelmed. He realized how close he'd come to missing everything that followed. Kindness hadn't made him rich overnight. It hadn't erased hardship or pain. But it opened a door to dignity, opportunity, and a future where his daughter would grow up knowing her father mattered. And as Marcus held Aaliyah close, he understood something deeply and finally. Sometimes, the smallest act in the worst weather can change the rest of your life forever.